Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today in almost the world's largest measuring social outcomes conference. I must admit, Andrew, I mentioned to my daughter last night when she asked me what I was doing today that I was flying to Sydney to talk at a measuring social outcomes conference. Look, in only the way that daughters can, she sort of looked at me out of the corner of my eye with a sort of mild disdain, and I just got the distinct impression that it wasn't going to be a feature of her Facebook page this morning. Now, measuring social outcomes may not be one of the topics that yet captures my daughter's attention, nor the broader public, but I think from Andrew's discussion this morning, when we start to have a look at some of the numbers, I think we pretty quickly realise that measuring social outcomes more effectively should be one of the issues that is right at the top of policymakers' agendas, policymakers like myself, and of course implementers like many of you in this room. Andrew gave a sense of some of the numbers. Federal government spending on human services alone, so just the human services piece, not welfare payments, is about $170 billion. It goes to a total of about $222 billion per annum when you add in the welfare payments. So just looking at the human services piece alone, that's about 13% of Australia's gross domestic product. And so even a small productivity gain, let's say 3% in that, would free up about or more than $5 billion per annum. To put that into context, it's getting on twice what the mining tax was originally estimated to bring in, and it's a long way to paying for the additional funds required for a national disability insurance scheme, just to put some of that improvement in context. So in this fiscally constrained environment, with those sorts of numbers potentially on the table, it's clear that how to drive productivity improvements in the social sector is a critical issue, or should be a critical issue. And to a certain extent, the number of people here at this conference gives me enormous hope that it is becoming so. I think this conference is certainly testament to the social sector's growing appreciation for the need to become much better at measuring the performance of social programs. But I think we have a long way to go. So this morning I want to cover off three things. The first is I want to explore some of the challenges. Now we've touched on some of those already this morning, but I want to explore those in a little bit more detail. I'll be coming at it from the government's perspective, but I want to incorporate a non-government perspective as well. I want to discuss some of the progress that I see that we're making, and I want to identify, if you like, a short, medium and long-term agenda for change. So first of all, what are the challenges to greater measurement of social outcomes? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is acknowledge that measuring social outcomes is actually hard work. And from my perspective in the federal government, it's particularly difficult. Many of the federal government's programs affect a very large segment of the Australian population. And this makes it very difficult to identify, if you like, a control group, a group that is not affected by the federal government's policies. Secondly, program implementation from a federal government perspective is often in the hands of others. State governments, not-for-profits, sometimes for-profits. So there is less direct control. And thirdly, in the social sector, we know that individuals can often decide whether or not they will receive treatment, if you like, or participate in a program. And they can change their behaviour in quite unexpected ways. So, for example, federal government might be looking to encourage skill acquisition amongst low-wage people, and we can actually find that perhaps higher wage people decide to take less hours to become eligible for that training program. A little bit of a perverse effect that operates in the social sector unless less likely in other places. So it's hard. I think it's also becoming harder. Globalisation, advances in information technology and a whole range of other factors are increasing our interconnectedness, particularly our social interconnectedness. There are more players involved than ever before. Once upon a time, governments were the dominant players in delivering social services. That's certainly not the case, and it's certainly not the case here in Australia. The role of not-for-profits, the role of for-profits, the role of a range of other organisations is absolutely critical. And at any one time in any of our communities, there's often a myriad of different interventions occurring, again, making it far, far more difficult to identify what changes are making the greatest difference. And in this context, there's obviously incredible risk, greater risk of unintended consequences. As Deborah Cobb-Clark from the University of Melbourne recently commented to me, program evaluation becomes more challenging as the complexity of the underlying policy intervention increases. And particularly challenging social problems are likely to be met with multifaceted policy initiatives with multiple objectives. And I'm sure many of you experience that day to day implementing the programs that you are in your communities. Thirdly, there are a number of institutional challenges that we need to acknowledge. At the federal government level, we have these wonderful things called the budget operating rules. Now, again, that's probably a topic that is unlikely to capture my daughter's imagination. But what it means is that ministers and their departments are expressly prevented from proposing what are called second round effects to offset the costs of a particular social program. In practice, that means that often the very things that we're trying to achieve from a social program, such as reduced unemployment or higher incomes and therefore higher tax take, the benefits to the federal government are actually excluded from calculating the cost. And in this sort of environment, there's actually very little incentive for ministers and for departments to demonstrate that they're achieving the social outcomes that they're actually trying to, that are the objective of the social program. Government departments, certainly in the federal level, have lost much of their program evaluation capability over recent decades. The World Bank has suggested that Australia was a case study for best practice in monitoring and evaluation in the period 1987 to 1997. During this time, the Department of Finance at the federal level was responsible for overseeing evaluation, and it acted as a key source of bureaucratic accountability for departments' monitoring and evaluation activities. After this time, however, responsibility for evaluation was devolved down to departments, and as budgets were cut, as they inevitably are, over time, evaluation teams, or the capacity of evaluation teams, was significantly diminished. And fourthly, there's a range of other practical issues that often significantly reduce the scope for robust evaluations. And I think many of these will be very, very familiar to you in the not-for-profit sector. A lack of budget, insufficient time, data constraints, etc., etc. Most program evaluations that do occur focus on processes, inputs, or at best outputs, rather than outcomes or impact. These evaluations usually begin at the end of a program rather than being planned during the program design and integrated into the program logic right up front. Unfortunately, better than nothing often passes for good enough. And certainly while I'm focusing my comments on government, my experience suggests that the not-for-profit sector certainly faces similar constraints. The pressures of finding funding, of beginning implementation and dealing with a myriad of stakeholders on the ground often means that measuring outcomes does not receive the sort of attention that it should until it's too late. So, you're probably all decided now that Don Quixote's had a better chance tilting at his windmills than we have of achieving effective measurement of social outcomes. But before you all give up and go and have a long liquid lunch or something like that, let me turn now to what I think are some of the really promising initiatives or progress that we're making. The difficult fiscal environment that both federal and state and territory governments find themselves at the moment is creating strong incentives to squeeze more out of existing dollars and to make the tough prioritisation decisions that Andrew was referring to before in some of his examples. This is helping to create an environment where certainly central agencies, and by that I mean agencies like the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that I'm from, and the Department of Treasury and Department of Finance, are particularly interested in evidence of social impact. And I was really interested in Andrew's little straw poll about how many of you think that funding will follow robust evaluation, or at least being able to demonstrate positive outcomes on the basis of robust evaluation. And I think, look, a healthy degree of scepticism is entirely appropriate. But what I'm suggesting to you this morning is the fiscal environment is pushing us all in the right direction, I think. It's making it much more likely that those organisations that are able to demonstrate impact with robust evaluations are going to get increased funding. Another very positive piece is that the Office for the Not-for-Profit Sector, which was created in 2010 in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and for which I have responsibility, has been working very hard across the whole of government to promote evaluation generally and social impact measurement in particular. And one example of the sorts of things that we're doing is we're developing guidelines for government departments at the moment on how and when they should apply social impact methodology to the programs that they fund. A number of other federal government departments are also starting to incorporate social impact methodologies into their work. The social return on investment method, which monetises social outputs and outcomes, is being used to evaluate the Community Development Financial Institution Pilot, what's called the CDFI Pilot, and the Step Up program. And I think Corinne is going to talk next about NAB's work in this regard. The Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations, better known to most of you as DEWA, requires its Social Enterprise Development and Investment Fund, CEDA fund, to measure and report on their social impact. Fund managers must produce an annual impact report, and I think Richard Seymour will be talking about the University of Sydney's work in this regard later on this afternoon. DEWA is also using social return on investment for the evaluation of its School Business Community Partnership Brokers program, and other departments are exploring options to even apply randomised control experiments, the so-called gold standard in evaluations, to a range of suitable programs. So there is a range of very positive initiatives being undertaken, and it's interesting that nearly all of them are being undertaken in the federal government's case in close collaboration with not-for-profits, with for-profits and with academic institutions. So there's great hope. But in this context, we certainly still do have a long way to go. And I want to spend just a little bit of time outlining what I think are some of the next steps. In the short term, we need to build up the evidence base for good evaluations. There are several ways of doing this. Certainly, the Office for the Not-for-Profit Sector is working with federal government departments to identify a range of other or new programs for which social impact methodologies and other forms of evaluation can be applied. More widespread adoption of particularly social impact methodologies has the potential, in my view, to significantly improve future public sector program design and evaluation practice, and needs to be significantly sought after. But we also need to work very closely with the non-government sectors to identify and promote good evaluation practice. You know, for example, I would love to see an Australian awards night, given that we've just had the Grammys and all sorts of other awards going on, for best social programs that celebrates the success and it's success based on robust evaluation, something we could all come and frock up about and have a great night. We also need to identify great overseas experience and practice. But in the longer term, we need to address the structural barriers that I mentioned. The structural barriers that prevent good evaluation, and we need to increase the formal and informal incentives, particularly for bureaucrats, to invest in evaluation. And I really want to stress my strong endorsement of Andrew's statement that success in this area will rely on all of us working together to achieve the sorts of outcomes. And that's why this conference, in my view, is so important. While my daughter may not yet appreciate it, if we are to take the steps required to ensure that Australia is a country where everyone has a fair go, where everyone has the resources, opportunities and capabilities to learn, work, engage and be heard on those things that are important to them, we need the very best social programs possible. And that means we need the very best social policy measurement possible. I wish you all the best. Thank you.